At this point, we're unfortunately breaking a climate-related record practically every year. Temperatures are rising and then rising some more. I feel like I'm melting in Chennai, so what do you think is happening in Antarctica? Hello and welcome to another episode of The Data Point. Today, we're taking a look at how much Antarctica's sea ice cover has dropped and what the impact of this is. On February 19th, sea ice cover levels in Antarctica fell to the lowest level ever recorded. When we look at how much sea ice cover has melted over the years, especially over the summer months, we see a worrying trend. Data shows that in the last 6 years especially, the Antarctic sea ice cover showed major declines, which, if you take a look at the way global temperatures have been rising, makes sense. So what happens when this sea ice melts? A couple of things. The most obvious and probably talked about problem is that of global sea levels rising, which is a major issue for coastal cities. According to NASA, meltwater makes up almost a third of the global average rise in sea levels since 1993. When we take a look at the data, we see that besides March and April, every other day recorded the lowest sea ice extent ever. Here, we see the sea ice extent recorded in million square kilometers. So let's take a closer look at May. We see that on May 20th, ice extent was at 8.73 million square kilometers, which is the lowest ever recorded on that specific date since 1950. But even if you look at 2023's trend line as a whole, we see that on many days, the sea ice extent was significantly lower than what was recorded in 2022. And up until this year, 2022 had recorded the lowest sea ice levels in Antarctica. Now, of course, one consequence of melting sea ice is rising sea levels, but there are several far less obvious impacts. When this much ice melts, it actually affects the way in which water flows across the world, affecting global weather and underwater ecosystems. According to a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Southern Ocean is important for the transfer of heat from the atmosphere to the global oceans. Scientists say that this increase in cold, fresh water from the melted ice can disrupt the way that cold, hot, fresh, salty water is circulated across the world's underwater currents. These changes in the ocean's temperature end up affecting weather patterns and the deep water nutrient flows. But even beyond these deep underwater changes, melting ice really affects the animals that are living near or on the surface. Algae that feed smaller crustaceans like krill, which whales, seals, penguins, and other birds all rely on as a food source, latch onto the surface of this disappearing sea ice. When we look at sea ice extent, we see that the white-colored portions show the actual sea ice extent on that day, while the orange boundary line shows the median sea ice extent between 1981 and 2010. So clearly, we can see that the ice levels have majorly fallen over the last few years. Less ice, less algae, less krill, and a major disruption to the Antarctic food chain. As global temperatures rise, the Antarctic region also saw higher temperatures this year. With less sea ice cover, more of the sun's heat ends up getting absorbed. How? Because of what's known as the ice albedo feedback cycle. The ice helps reflect back some of the sun's heat, and when there's less ice, more heat ends up getting absorbed by the darker colored ocean. Antarctica has generally seen irregularities in temperature over the years, and here we see the increase or decrease of Antarctica's temperature in April of each year compared to the 1910 to 2000 average. In 2023, the April temperature was 0.93 degrees Celsius higher than the 1910 to 2000 average for that month. That's the second highest increase in the millennia. So at this point, you might be thinking, why is this such a big deal? Doesn't the ice that melts over the summer just refreeze during the winter months? Yes, ice does refreeze in the winter, but given the scale of the melting, not as much ice is forming in the winter anymore. So even though sea ice melts every year, This year's melting was far greater than what was recorded in the past. February 19th recorded 1.76 million square kilometers of Antarctic sea ice extent, which is the lowest ever. So yes, while some ice is still forming again in the winter, freshly formed ice is generally thinner than multi-year ice. This means that the overall surface area of Antarctica is in a far more fragile state. And because it's in this fragile state, it's more susceptible to breaking off, melting, and then the cycle continues.